He thought forcing her onto that stage would be harmless entertainment. But in that moment, without realizing it, Victor Langford set the stage for the quiet collapse of his own reputation. The grand hall of the Harrington Symphony Theater shimmered under warm golden lights, crystal chandeliers casting soft reflections across polished marble floors as the audience, dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, settled into velvet seats, murmurs of anticipation floating like a low hum in the air. And moving almost invisibly among them was Emily Carter, her simple gray uniform blending into the background as she wiped down the last row of armrests with steady, practiced motions, her presence so unnoticed it was as if she were part of the building itself. At 39, Emily carried herself with a quiet composure that most mistook for submission, her brown hair tied back neatly, her eyes lowered not from insecurity but from habit, a life lived on the edges of rooms where people like Victor stood at the center. Victor Langford, the celebrated conductor of the Harrington Symphony, stood near the stage entrance surrounded by admirers, his tailored black tuxedo immaculate, his voice smooth and confident as he exchanged polite laughter with donors and critics, every gesture reinforcing his authority in this world of music and prestige. He was known not only for his talent, but for his sharp judgment, his ability to immediately categorize people, those who belonged and those who did not. And when his gaze briefly fell on Emily as she passed behind the orchestra pit carrying a small cleaning cart, there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes, the kind reserved for something insignificant yet oddly entertaining. The evening's performance had been meticulously planned, every musician selected, every note rehearsed to perfection, but moments before the opening, a problem emerged as the lead violinist failed to arrive, whispers spreading quickly among the staff, tension threading through the backstage corridors. Victor's expression hardened, irritation replacing charm as he scanned the room for a solution, and then, almost casually, his eyes returned to Emily, who had paused near the wings, holding a forgotten violin case she had just picked up from a chair. It was a small, almost accidental detail, but to Victor, it became an opportunity. He stepped toward her, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor, drawing the attention of a few nearby musicians who watched with curiosity, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "You," he said, his tone light, but edged with something sharper. "You seem to know your way around that instrument." And Emily looked up, surprised, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of the case, her expression calm but unreadable. A few of the orchestra members exchanged glances, a quiet ripple of amusement beginning to form as Victor continued. "We have an unexpected gap tonight, and it would be a shame to disappoint our audience, wouldn't it?" His smile widening just enough to signal that this was not a genuine offer, but something else entirely. The nearby musicians chuckled softly, the kind of restrained laughter that feeds on hierarchy, and the energy shifted as more people began to notice. The idea of a cleaning woman stepping onto that stage transforming into a spectacle before it had even happened. Emily remained still for a moment, her eyes meeting Victor's just long enough to register the intent behind his words, the subtle mockery, the assumption that she would either refuse or fail spectacularly. And for a brief second, the noise of the hall seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet stillness that only she seemed to feel. Victor gestured toward the stage with theatrical flair, as if inviting her into a joke that only he controlled, and the orchestra members stepped back slightly, creating space not out of respect, but out of curiosity. Somewhere in the audience, a ripple of laughter carried faintly through the curtains, unaware of what was about to unfold, and Emily, still holding the violin case, took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, her face calm, but something in her eyes, something steady and unshaken, suggested that this moment, which everyone else saw as a performance of humiliation, was about to become something entirely different. The lights dimmed slightly as the stage prepared for the opening, and Victor, confident in his control of the situation, stepped aside with a satisfied expression, certain that he had just created an amusing distraction for his audience, never imagining that within seconds, the entire room would fall into a silence he could neither command nor escape. Emily stepped forward slowly, each step measured against the polished wood floor that reflected the stage lights like a mirror, and the faint sound of her shoes echoed just enough to draw more attention from the audience beyond the curtains, where whispers had already begun to ripple through the crowd as they noticed the unexpected delay. While backstage, a few musicians leaned closer to one another, their expressions shifting between curiosity and quiet amusement, as if they were watching a scene unfold that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with hierarchy. Victor remained near the edge of the stage, arms loosely folded, his posture relaxed with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled every outcome. His lips curved into a subtle smile that suggested he expected nothing more than a brief, forgettable spectacle, and when Emily reached the center of the stage entrance, she paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the violin case, her gaze lifting toward the vast auditorium where hundreds of faces sat in anticipation, unaware that what they were about to witness was not part of the program. The stage manager hesitated, glancing at Victor for confirmation, and with a slight nod, the signal was given, the curtains parting just enough to reveal Emily stepping into the light. And the shift was immediate as the low murmur of conversation in the audience sharpened into audible curiosity, heads tilting, brows furrowing as they took in the sight of a woman in a simple uniform standing where a renowned violinist was expected to be. A few soft laughs broke through the room, subtle but unmistakable, carried by those who assumed they understood the situation, and Emily felt the weight of those reactions settle around her, not pressing her down, but surrounding her like a familiar atmosphere she had learned to move within. She set the violin case on a nearby chair and opened it with careful precision, her movements calm and unhurried, as though she were alone in a quiet room rather than under the gaze of an entire auditorium. And for a brief moment, her fingers lingered on the instrument, tracing its polished surface with a familiarity that did not match the assumptions being made about her. Victor stepped forward slightly, addressing the audience with a tone that carried both charm and a hint of mischief, explaining that, due to an unforeseen circumstance, they would begin the evening with an unexpected performance. His words carefully chosen to maintain the illusion of control while inviting the audience to share in the novelty of the moment, and a ripple of polite laughter followed, reinforcing his authority and the collective belief that this was all part of an amusing diversion. Emily lifted the violin gently, positioning it against her shoulder with a natural ease that went largely unnoticed, overshadowed by the audience's expectation of awkwardness. And as she adjusted the bow in her hand, a few musicians backstage exchanged glances again, this time with a faint trace of uncertainty beginning to replace their earlier amusement. The conductor's baton remained still in Victor's hand as he watched her, waiting, almost savoring the pause before what he assumed would be a brief and clumsy attempt, and the silence in the hall deepened, not yet tense, but expectant, filled with the quiet anticipation of something trivial, something to be laughed at and quickly forgotten. Emily closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in focus, as if aligning herself with something internal that existed beyond the room, beyond the audience, beyond Victor's expectations. And when she opened them again, her expression had not changed, but there was a steadiness there that had not been present before, a quiet certainty that did not seek validation. The bow hovered just above the strings, and in that suspended moment, time seemed to stretch, the air in the auditorium holding its breath without realizing it. And Victor's smile remained, though it faltered almost imperceptibly as something in the stillness began to feel unfamiliar, as if the scene he had orchestrated was no longer entirely under his control. And then, without announcement or flourish, Emily drew the bow across the strings, and the first note emerged, clear and resonant, cutting through the space with a precision that did not belong to chance. And in that instant, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as the laughter that had lingered at the edges of the room disappeared, replaced by a silence that felt different, heavier, as if the entire auditorium had suddenly realized it was witnessing something it did not yet understand. The note did not fade the way a beginner's attempt should have. It did not waver or collapse under pressure. Instead, it expanded, full and controlled, filling the hall with a clarity that seemed to press gently against every surface. And in that single sustained sound, the assumption that had hovered over the room began to fracture. Emily's arm moved with deliberate precision, the bow gliding across the strings as if guided by years of memory rather than momentary courage, and as she transitioned into the next phrase, the tone deepened, layered with emotion that could not be rehearsed in a few seconds backstage. It carried weight, history, something lived rather than performed, and the audience, who had been leaning forward with mild amusement, slowly straightened, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion, then to something quieter, something more attentive. Victor's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, the relaxed confidence draining from his stance as his eyes narrowed, focusing not on the novelty of the situation anymore, but on the sound itself, dissecting it with the trained ear that had built his reputation. And what he heard did not align with the narrative he had created. The phrasing was too refined, the timing too exact, the control too complete. This was not imitation, this was mastery. Backstage, the orchestra members who had been exchanging smirks moments earlier now stood still, their conversations cut short, one violinist lowering his instrument slowly as if afraid to disturb the unfolding moment, another glancing at Victor, searching for a cue that did not come, because for the first time that evening, Victor had none to give. Emily's movements remained calm, almost understated, her expression unchanged, her focus entirely on the instrument, and as the melody developed, it revealed complexity that demanded attention, subtle shifts in dynamics, delicate transitions that spoke of discipline and understanding far beyond what anyone had expected, and with each passing second, the room grew quieter, not because it had been instructed to, but because it no longer knew how to respond. A woman in the front row, who had earlier whispered to her companion with a faint smile, now sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the stage, her lips parted slightly, as if she had forgotten what she was about to say, while a man beside her adjusted his posture, leaning forward with intent, his earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of disbelief. Victor took a step closer to the stage, his polished shoes making a soft sound against the floor, but even that seemed too loud against the music that now commanded the space. His grip on the conductor's baton tightening slightly, though he did not raise it, because there was nothing for him to direct, nothing for him to control, and that realization settled over him with a quiet weight. Emily transitioned into a more intricate passage, her fingers moving with speed and accuracy that blurred the line between effort and instinct, and there was no hesitation, no sign of strain, only a seamless flow that suggested this was not an extraordinary moment for her, but something familiar, something she had done countless times before, just not here, not in front of these people, not under these assumptions. The audience felt it, even if they could not articulate it, the shift from novelty to significance, from amusement to recognition. And the silence that now filled the hall was different from the one that had preceded her first note. It was not expectant, it was absorbed, every person present drawn into the sound with a focus that left no room for distraction. Victor's expression changed, the subtle smile completely gone now, replaced by a stillness that bordered on disbelief, as if he were watching something that contradicted not just his expectations, but his understanding of the situation entirely. And for the first time that evening, he was no longer the one shaping the experience. He was part of it, subject to it, unable to alter its course. Emily did not look at him, did not acknowledge the audience, did not react to the shifting energy around her. She simply played, each note precise, each phrase intentional, and as the melody reached a point of quiet intensity, the kind that draws listeners inward rather than pushing outward, the room seemed to hold itself in place, suspended in a moment that no one wanted to interrupt, because somewhere, without announcement or explanation, the narrative had changed, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet understand how or why. The music did not rush to impress. It did not attempt to overwhelm with speed or volume. Instead, it unfolded with a quiet authority that commanded attention without asking for it. And as Emily moved into the next passage, the complexity deepened in a way that only trained ears could fully appreciate, subtle variations in tone layered over one another, phrasing that required not just technical precision, but an understanding of emotion that could not be taught in a classroom alone. And in that moment, the audience began to realize that they were no longer witnessing an unexpected substitution. They were witnessing something far more rare, Victor felt it before he could fully process it, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with recognition. Because the interpretation she was delivering was not standard, it was deliberate, nuanced, carrying a signature that suggested years of refinement, and his mind moved quickly, searching through memory, trying to place the style, the control, the unmistakable confidence hidden beneath her understated presence. But nothing aligned with what he saw in front of him. Backstage, one of the senior violinists took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on Emily's hands, watching the way her fingers moved across the strings with effortless accuracy, and he shook his head. Slightly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood something the others were only beginning to grasp, while another musician lowered his gaze, a quiet realization settling in that the line between performer and observer had just shifted in a way none of them had anticipated. Emily's expression remained calm, her posture steady, but there was a subtle change in her presence now, something that could not be seen directly but could be felt, a quiet expansion of confidence that did not seek approval, as if the stage, once used to elevate others, had simply become a place where she returned to something familiar. The melody transitioned again, rising into a section that demanded both power and restraint, and she delivered it with a balance so precise that it left no room for doubt. Every note placed exactly where it needed to be, every pause intentional, creating a rhythm that drew the audience deeper into the performance without their awareness, and the silence in the hall grew heavier, not empty, but filled with a tension so complete that even the smallest movement seemed amplified. A man in the second row, a longtime patron known for his critical ear, leaned back slowly, his expression shifting from analysis to something closer to respect, while a young student seated near the aisle clasped her hands together, her earlier curiosity replaced by admiration she could not yet explain. Victor took another step, closer now to the edge of the stage, his usual composure replaced by a stillness that bordered on uncertainty, his baton lowering slightly at his side as he realized that intervening, even subtly, would disrupt something that no longer belonged to him. And for the first time in years, he was not the one guiding the narrative of the performance. Emily moved into the final segment of the piece, her bow gliding with a confidence that suggested completion rather than conclusion, as if the music itself was guiding her to its natural end. And there was no hesitation, no sign of fatigue, only a steady progression toward a moment that the entire room could feel approaching, even if they could not define it. The last sequence built not through volume, but through clarity, each note standing distinct yet connected, forming a pattern that held the audience in place. And when the final note came, it did not crash or demand applause, it settled into the space with a quiet finality, resonating just long enough to leave an imprint before fading into stillness. And then there was nothing. No immediate reaction, no polite clapping, no murmured commentary. Just a complete and absolute silence that spread across the hall like a shared realization. The kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty, but from the sudden understanding that something extraordinary has just occurred. And in that silence, Victor stood motionless, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more fragile, because he understood now, without question, that the moment he had orchestrated as a spectacle had become something else entirely, something he could neither claim nor undo. And as Emily lowered the violin from her shoulder, her gaze steady and her posture unchanged, the room remained still, as if waiting, not for permission to respond, but for the weight of what they had just witnessed to fully settle. For a moment that stretched longer than anyone expected, no one moved, no one spoke, and the silence that filled the hall carried a weight that could not be ignored, because it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of recognition, the kind that arrives when assumptions are quietly dismantled in front of an audience that thought it understood everything. Emily stood at the center of the stage with the violin resting lightly at her side, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement, as if the performance itself had already said everything that needed to be said. And it was this quiet composure, more than the music, that unsettled the room, because there was no attempt to claim attention, no gesture to invite applause, only a stillness that forced everyone else to confront their own reaction. It began slowly. A single pair of hands coming together from somewhere near the front row, tentative at first, almost uncertain, followed by another, and then another, until the sound of applause built not in excitement, but in realization, growing stronger as more people joined, not out of obligation, but out of a shared understanding that what they had witnessed demanded acknowledgement. And as the applause filled the hall, it carried a different energy than before, not casual, not polite, but deliberate, sustained, and unmistakably genuine. Victor remained where he stood, his posture rigid, his expression caught between composure and something far less certain, his mind racing through the events that had just unfolded, replaying each moment with a clarity that only deepened the realization of his miscalculation, because this had not been a brief diversion, it had not been an amusing interruption, it had been a performance that met, and perhaps exceeded, the standard he had spent years establishing. And the fact that it had come from someone he had dismissed so easily was not something he could reconcile quickly. The orchestra members began to shift, some lowering their heads slightly, others exchanging quiet glances that no longer carried amusement, but respect. And in those small, unspoken gestures, the hierarchy that had defined the room just minutes earlier began to dissolve, replaced by something more equal, more grounded in ability than appearance. Emily turned her gaze briefly toward the audience, acknowledging the applause with a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a performer seeking validation, but as someone recognizing a shared moment. And then she stepped back, moving away from the center of the stage with the same calm precision she had carried throughout, her presence neither expanding nor shrinking in response to the attention now directed at her. Victor finally stepped forward, the weight of expectation settling onto him as the conductor, as the figure meant to guide the evening. But for the first time, his usual confidence did not return immediately, and when he addressed the audience, his voice, though controlled, lacked the effortless authority it had held before, as if something within him had shifted, something that could not be undone by a simple continuation of the program. He offered a brief acknowledgement of the unexpected performance, his words measured, careful, but noticeably restrained, and while the audience responded with continued applause, their focus remained divided, their attention lingering on Emily even as she moved toward the edge of the stage. Backstage, the energy had changed completely, conversations hushed, movements slower, more deliberate, as if everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something that would be remembered, something that would be discussed long after the evening ended. And in that awareness, there was a quiet humility that had not been there before. Emily placed the violin gently back into its case, her hands steady, her movements unhurried, and as she closed the lid, the sound of the latch clicking into place carried a finality that felt symbolic, as if the moment had been contained, completed, without the need for further explanation. She did not look toward Victor, did not seek acknowledgement from the orchestra, and did not linger for recognition. Instead, she turned and walked toward the side exit, her footsteps soft against the floor, her figure gradually blending back into the background from which she had come. And yet, despite her departure, the presence she had left behind remained, embedded in the atmosphere of the hall, in the minds of those who had witnessed the shift from assumption to truth. Victor watched her go, his expression unreadable, but his stillness spoke louder than any reaction, because in that moment, he understood something that could not be undone, that respect is not granted by position, nor withheld by appearance, but revealed, often unexpectedly, in moments where control is lost and truth is allowed to surface. And as the evening resumed, the music that followed carried a different tone, not because it had changed, but because the people listening had. And the memory of that quiet woman standing at the center of the stage, turning a moment of mockery into one of undeniable mastery, lingered long after the final note of the night had faded, leaving behind a silence that, even filled with applause, could not be forgotten. The rest of the evening continued, but something intangible had shifted beneath the surface of the Harrington Symphony Theater, something that no carefully rehearsed performance could fully restore, because the audience was no longer listening the same way, their attention no longer shaped solely by expectation or reputation, but by the quiet memory of what they had just witnessed, Conversations during intermission carried a different tone. Voices lowered not out of politeness, but out of reflection, as people who had arrived with certainty now found themselves reconsidering the assumptions they had made so easily. And among them, a few began to ask questions, not loudly, not publicly, but with a curiosity that lingered beneath the surface, wondering who Emily Carter truly was, and how someone who had moved unnoticed through the theater could command a stage with such authority. Backstage, the atmosphere remained subdued, the usual rhythm of preparation replaced by a careful quiet, as if everyone present was aware that something unspoken had changed, and the musicians, though professional in their duties, carried themselves differently, their earlier confidence tempered by a recognition that talent did not always present itself in expected forms. Victor stood apart from the others, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the side corridor where Emily had disappeared, his mind replaying the performance with a precision that bordered on obsession. Each note, each phrase analyzed not for critique, but for understanding, because what he had heard did not align with the narrative he had constructed, and for a man who had built his career on control and discernment, that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He adjusted his cufflinks absent-mindedly, a habitual gesture that usually grounded him, but tonight it offered little comfort, because the certainty he relied on had been quietly disrupted, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through undeniable skill displayed, without demand for recognition. When the final piece of the evening concluded and the audience rose in applause, the energy was strong, appreciative, but still carried an undercurrent of something else, something quieter, as if the performance they had truly come to remember had already taken place earlier, unannounced and unplanned. As the crowd began to filter out into the cool night air, conversations continued, some animated, others thoughtful, but nearly all touched, in some way, on the unexpected moment that had altered the course of the evening, and even those who did not speak of it directly carried the impression with them, a subtle shift in perspective that would linger long after the details faded. Victor remained on stage longer than usual, acknowledging the orchestra, exchanging brief words with donors, maintaining the composure expected of him, but his attention was divided, his thoughts returning again and again to the quiet figure who had stepped onto the stage and left without seeking acknowledgement. And when the formalities were complete, he turned toward the backstage corridor with a purpose that had not been present earlier, his steps measured but deliberate, as if he were following a thread he could not ignore. The hallway beyond the stage was quieter now, the bustle of preparation replaced by the soft sounds of closing tasks, instruments being packed, lights being dimmed, and as Victor moved through the space, a few staff members glanced at him with a different expression than before, not deferential in the same way, but observant, as if they too had seen something that shifted their understanding of the hierarchy within these walls. He reached the area where the cleaning supplies were kept, a place he had likely passed countless times without noticing, and there, near a small service door, he saw the cart Emily had been using earlier, neatly arranged, as if it had been returned to its place with the same care she had shown in everything else. But she was not there, and the absence felt more significant than her presence had been before. Victor paused, his gaze lingering on the quiet space. And for a moment, there was no music, no audience, no performance to manage. Only the realization that he had witnessed something he could not fully explain, and that the person who had revealed it had done so without seeking acknowledgement, without altering her place in the world around her. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the stillness, and turned back toward the stage, but the certainty with which he had once moved through these halls did not return in the same way, because somewhere between the first note and the final silence, the boundaries he had relied on had been quietly redrawn, not by force, but by truth, and that truth did not demand recognition, it simply existed, waiting for those willing to see it. And as the lights dimmed, and the theater settled into its end-of-night stillness, the echo of that realization lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like a note that refused to fade. The theater had emptied, but the echo of that single performance refused to fade, lingering not in the walls, but in the minds of those who had witnessed it. And long after the last guest had stepped out into the quiet city streets, a small group of musicians remained backstage, their conversations low, thoughtful, and unusually restrained, as if they were still processing something that did not fit neatly into their understanding of talent and status. One violinist, a man who had spent over 2 decades performing on that very stage, sat on a wooden chair with his instrument resting across his lap, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the strings without producing sound, his gaze distant as he replayed Emily's performance in his mind, not searching for flaws, but trying to understand the depth behind what he had heard. And beside him, a younger musician spoke quietly, asking questions that carried more humility than curiosity, questions that revealed a shift in perspective that could not easily be reversed. Victor stood a few feet away, listening without joining, his presence no longer commanding the same immediate attention, because the authority he carried had been subtly challenged, not by confrontation, but by contrast. And as he finally spoke, his voice was measured, lacking the sharp certainty it once held. He asked a simple question, one that seemed almost out of place coming from him. Did anyone know her? And the silence that followed was not empty, but telling. Because no one answered immediately, not out of reluctance, but because the question itself revealed how little they had truly seen before. Eventually, a stagehand spoke up, a man who had worked in the theater for years without recognition, his voice steady but respectful, explaining that Emily had been part of the cleaning staff for nearly 3 years, always punctual, always quiet, never drawing attention to herself. And as he spoke, the details painted a picture that felt almost impossible to reconcile with the performance they had witnessed, because nothing in her role suggested the level of mastery she had displayed, and yet, the evidence of it was undeniable. Victor absorbed the information slowly, his mind shifting from disbelief to realization, because the absence of recognition was not due to a lack of evidence, but a lack of attention, and that distinction settled heavily on him, forcing him to confront something far less comfortable than being wrong, the possibility that he had simply not looked closely enough. He moved toward the service corridor once more, his steps quieter now, less certain, and when he reached the small area where Emily's cart had been earlier, he noticed something he had overlooked before, a small, worn notebook resting on a nearby shelf, its cover plain, almost forgettable, but slightly open as if it had been left in the middle of use. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up, not out of entitlement, but out of a growing need to understand, and when he opened it, he found pages filled with handwritten notes, not casual scribbles, but detailed annotations of musical pieces, phrasing, timing, interpretations that reflected a level of study and discipline that could not be dismissed as accidental. And as he turned the pages, the realization deepened, because this was not a hidden talent that had appeared suddenly. It was a cultivated mastery that had existed quietly, consistently, without recognition. He closed the notebook slowly, the weight of it not in its physical form, but in what it represented, a reminder that brilliance does not always announce itself, and that the absence of visibility does not equate to the absence of value. And for a moment, he stood there in the quiet corridor, the distant hum of the buildings settling around him, as he considered what to do next, not as a conductor, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who had just witnessed something that demanded a response beyond routine. And somewhere beyond the walls of the theater, Emily walked alone under the soft glow of streetlights, her pace unhurried, her expression calm, as if the evening had been no different from any other, her violin no longer in her hands, but the music still present within her, not as a performance, but as a part of who she was, untouched by the opinions of others, steady and unchanging. And as the distance between her and the theater grew, so did the quiet understanding that what had happened on that stage was not an exception, not a moment of chance, but a glimpse into something that had always been there, waiting, not to be discovered, but simply to be seen. The following morning arrived with a quiet clarity that contrasted sharply with the tension of the night before. The Harrington Symphony Theater, standing still in the early light, as if unaware that anything extraordinary had taken place within its walls, yet inside, the subtle shift remained, carried in the thoughts of those who returned, in the way they moved through the corridors, in the glances exchanged without words. Victor arrived earlier than usual, his steps echoing softly against the marble floors, his presence no longer accompanied by the same effortless certainty. Because the questions from the night before had not settled, they had grown, shaping his thoughts in ways he could not ignore. And as he walked past the rows of empty seats, he paused, looking toward the stage where Emily had stood, the memory of that moment as vivid as if it were happening again, and for the first time in years. He was not thinking about programming, reputation, or control, but about understanding something he had overlooked. He made his way backstage, the quiet of the morning amplifying each small sound. And when he reached the service corridor, he found it as he had left it, the cleaning cart in place, the shelf with its small, worn notebook still there, and for a moment, he stood still, as if expecting something to change simply by being present. But nothing did, because the answer he was looking for was not in the room. It was in the person who had already left it. Elsewhere in the building, a few staff members had begun their routine, their movements familiar, yet their awareness different, because the invisible line that had once separated roles had been quietly challenged. And as Emily entered through the side door, her steps as calm and steady as ever, she did not carry the weight of the previous night in a visible way. She wore the same simple uniform, her hair tied back, her expression composed, as if nothing had altered her place in this world. And yet, those who noticed her now did so differently, their eyes lingering a moment longer, their nods more deliberate, as if acknowledging something they had only just begun to understand. Victor saw her from across the corridor, and for a brief moment, he did not move, not out of hesitation, but because the simplicity of the scene contrasted so sharply with the complexity of what he had witnessed. And when he finally stepped forward, his approach was measured, not commanding, not performative, but careful, as if he were entering a conversation that required more listening than speaking. Emily looked up as he approached, her gaze steady, neither defensive nor expectant, simply present. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but reflective, holding the weight of everything that had gone unsaid the night before. Victor spoke first, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the authority that had once defined it, acknowledging her performance without embellishment, without framing it as an anomaly, but as something real, something that deserved recognition beyond circumstance. And as he spoke, there was no audience, no stage, no need to control perception. Only a quiet exchange between two people standing in a corridor that had once separated them by assumption. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when she responded, her words were simple, not dismissive, not seeking validation, but grounded in a quiet truth that did not rely on external acknowledgement. And in that response, Victor understood something that could not be taught through experience alone, that mastery does not always seek visibility, and that recognition, when it comes, does not change what has always existed. The moment did not stretch into something dramatic. There was no sudden shift in roles, no grand declaration, only a subtle adjustment in understanding. And as they stood there, the hierarchy that had once defined their interaction no longer held the same weight, replaced by something quieter, something based not on titles or appearances, but on a shared awareness of truth. As Emily returned to her work, moving through the corridor with the same steady pace, Victor remained where he stood for a moment longer, the simplicity of her actions reinforcing what he had begun to realize, that the most significant shifts do not announce themselves loudly, they unfold quietly. In moments where perception changes, where assumptions are replaced by understanding. And as the day continued, the theater resumed its routine, but beneath that routine, something had changed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that could not be undone, because once something is truly seen, it cannot be unseen, and the memory of that performance, and the quiet dignity that followed it, remained, not as an exception, but as a reminder of what exists beyond expectation. Days passed, and while the theater returned to its familiar rhythm of rehearsals and performances, something quieter remained beneath the surface, a shift not announced but understood, carried in the way people observed one another, in the way assumptions were no longer made as quickly or as easily as before. Emily continued her routine without change, arriving at the same time each morning, moving through the same corridors with the same steady pace, her presence once again blending into the background. But now, it was a different kind of invisibility, not one born of dismissal, but one chosen, deliberate, untouched by the recognition that had briefly found her. Those who had witnessed that night could not unsee what they had seen, and even those who had only heard about. It spoke with a tone that carried respect rather than curiosity, because the story, though simple in its facts, had revealed something far more complex in its meaning. Victor found himself returning often to the stage when it was empty, standing where he always had, but now with a different awareness, as if the space itself held a memory that guided his thoughts. And in those quiet moments, he no longer saw the stage as a place he controlled, but as a place where truth could appear without permission, without warning, reshaping everything it touched. He had considered offering Emily a formal opportunity, a position within the orchestra, a public acknowledgement that would align her visible role with her undeniable ability. But each time the thought formed, it met with something deeper, a recognition that what he had witnessed was not dependent on his validation, that her worth did not increase with his approval, and that any gesture he made would reflect his understanding, not define hers. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the theater lobby, Victor saw Emily again, moving quietly as she arranged a set of chairs, her movements precise, her focus complete, and for a moment, he simply watched, not as a conductor evaluating a performer, but as someone observing another person without the filter of expectation. And in that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for years, that greatness does not announce itself through status or appearance. It exists independently, revealed only when circumstance allows it to be seen. He approached her once more, not with authority, not with an offer, but with a simple acknowledgement, a few words that carried no agenda, no expectation of response, only recognition, and Emily met that acknowledgement with the same quiet composure she had shown before, her reply measured, grounded, reflecting a perspective that did not seek elevation, but remained rooted in who she already was. There was no dramatic resolution, no sudden transformation of roles, no public declaration that altered the structure of the world around them, because the most meaningful change had already occurred, not in position, but in perception, and that change did not require spectacle to be real. As the theater continued its season, performances came and went, audiences filled the seats and left again, the cycle repeating as it always had. But for those who had been present that night, there remained a subtle awareness, a quiet reminder that the person standing unnoticed beside them could carry a depth they had not yet considered, and that the absence of recognition does not diminish the presence of value. Emily remained who she had always been, her routine unchanged, her demeanor steady, her skill neither displayed nor hidden, simply existing as a part of her, untouched by the need for acknowledgement. And in that consistency, there was a strength that did not rely on external validation, a dignity that did not shift with circumstance. Victor, in turn, carried the memory forward, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as a lesson that reshaped the way he saw the world around him, a quiet correction that no applause could match. And as he stood once more in the empty hall, the silence around him no longer felt like something to be filled, but something to be understood, because in that silence, he had learned what true presence sounded like, and it was not loud, not commanding, but steady, undeniable, and real. And on that day, without announcement, without recognition, the world within those walls had changed, not because someone demanded to be seen, but because, for a brief moment, everyone had finally chosen to look, and in that choice, they discovered what dignity truly looks like.